that those struggles may be more akin, and indeed arguably the two strategies, interstitial and symbiotic strategies, more akin to an assimilation into the capitalist system rather than a conflict with the capitalist system. Rupture depends, I don't think it's a fantasy. I think it very much depends on the conditions in an individual country. I think it may be more realistic in Greece than it is in Ireland currently. And it will depend very much on the conditions in each place. But I don't think that the prospects of rupture strategy should be dismissed as an illusion. I think it's difficult. I think there's a long path to be worked out. But I also want to say that thank you again for your interesting talk. I think it's one of the challenges to people on the left. We need to actually deal with those.
I think what I'll do is add a short comment when I think it adds to something I've already said, rather than just keep repeating. And there'll be times for me to be repetitive anyway, I'm sure. I just had one little thought. If we ask ourselves, let us suppose we agree that at some point an absolute ruptural break is needed, that there is no metamorphosis possible, that at some point you have to smash the ruling class. Okay, let's assume that's true. Then the question is, under what conditions is that most likely to result in a democratic egalitarian alternative rather than a statist authoritarianism? That is, the historic experience with the attempts has resulted in authoritarian statist economies, not democratic egalitarian ones. That's been the practical result of attempts. So we want to increase the odds that when a rupture occurs, it actually results in emancipation in the conditions for universal human flourishing under egalitarian and democratic conditions. One argument then that I would make is building interstitially a cooperative market economy to the extent possible under capitalism creates a better environment for a future rupture, if a rupture is needed, than attempting a rupture in the absence of already having built collaborative, cooperative market forms. So the move from a mixed capitalist cooperative market economy with capitalists still being dominant and therefore needing to be smashed, a move from there to a socialist economy is more likely to actually result in what we want than a move from a more purely capitalist economy. And therefore, even if you're a rupturalist, if that argument is correct, even if you're a rupturalist, we should also be struggling for this interplay of symbiotic and interstitial transformations, because it creates a better environment for future rupture.
Yeah, John, I think.
Yeah, John Molyneux, Socialist Workers' Party, and editor of a rival magazine. Symbiotic. Okay. I feel a bit like the Maoist I'm not a Maoist, but I feel a bit like the Maoist because I am an unreconstructed rupturalist. Well, I think it could be called a revolutionary. Right, if you look at your little chart up there, it seems to me that, I don't know what it's actually based on, apart from kind of, it would be nice if it worked that way, but there is, the sort of classical Marxist objection to that surely would be that you can possibly have your rising curve reaching your optimal point in conditions, as you yourself indicated, of a sort of capitalist boom, 50s and 60s and so on. But unfortunately, capitalism being a system of contradictions goes into severe crises, and then that equilibrium there doesn't work anymore. And what happens is not that you simply move on to another thing, but there's an intense struggle in which you either go back to total capitalist domination, say fascist form and so on, or you go forward to working class domination. I mean, that would be the classical Marxist answer to that, as in, either 1917 or the 1930s and so on. Today, we have the crisis, but we also have something else coming on, which is we have currently occurring climate change, which suggests we don't have centuries for the transition from feudalism to capitalism. I mean, unfortunately, we've probably got, maybe 10, 20 years or something before we face something much worse. So I don't think that That's really an option. The other thing I want to say is that you started with 3 strategies: the rupturalist, the interstitial, and the symbiotic. But it wasn't really like the introduction suggested, where we marry all 3. It was really, you reject the rupturalist, really, and incorporate the interstitial within the symbiotic as I mean, it is really a new left reformism that you're advocating, I think. So that's how it strikes me, and I do. I mean, if you say it as a one-liner, like Michael did, because time is restricted, you say, "What about the capitalist state?" We can come back with how complicated the capitalist state is and its contradictions and so on. But, and I will quote, I do think Marx was right, and I will quote him on this, not because he's God, but because I do think he was right in saying, as on the basis of the Paris Commune, that it's not possible for the working class to take over and use the capitalist state to serve its own purposes. I think that really I think that's an illusion. I think that's a bigger illusion, actually, than the idea of workers' revolution.
Well, I don't know if it's bigger. They may be both equally illusory.
Yeah, and it all might be doom, and nothing may be possible, and
if it literally is true that the time horizon is 20 years where the game's over, then the game's over. There's no conceivable way we're going to have socialist revolutions in the advanced countries in the next 20 years.
How do you know that?
On the basis of everything I've studied about the problems of fragmentation of working classes, about the nature of competition, about the risk aversion under different time horizons, I would give it very close to 0 probability that there will be socialist revolutions in developed capitalist countries. I put any amount of money bet on that. So I could be wrong, but that's my prediction. And if that is, so if it really is true, we have only 20 years left.
30, 40. But left before we have such an intense social crisis that it goes forward or backwards. I mean, do you not believe in climate change?
Oh, of course I believe in climate
Well,
change. I'm not a catastrophist on it.
No,
I
but
think,
it's going to get steadily worse.
I think capitalism is going to actually make a hell of a lot of money out of climate change.
And solve it? And thereby deal with it?
There'll be a huge amount of suffering. Capitalism is extremely good at creating suffering. Suffering has never been sufficient to challenge structures of power. That's just not the way social change works. You can dramatically increase suffering, and you get internecine struggles among the sufferers. That's the typical response that happens when there's intensified suffering.
Well, you may be right, but at least we should try and do something about it.
So we have about half an hour left, so I'm going to just cut. If we can keep them slightly short as well. There's 5 people queued up with comments, 6 now.
My name's Justin O'Brien, I'm with the Workers' Party. So like previously around ruptures.
And I make a procedural point. It's nice that people stand up because then you can hear them and see them much better.
I can see that. My name's Justin. And, a question about the way that you formulate democracy. If you're, and also there seems to be, just as a side point, it seems to be very Western, industrialized, rich country centric, your approach. What about if it's the difference between having clean water, good housing conditions, and a well-paid job? Is that not a democratic right, or is that and maybe other rights are foregone in the pursuit of that kind of that kind of standard of living? Because that you can't really have discussions of this kind if people are hungry and don't have roofs.
So I'm using the term democracy to refer to the organization of power, and equality to refer to the organization of access to resources. So those are the good housing, good healthcare, living conditions are egalitarian demands.
Yes.
But they're not democratic demands.
No. Well,
They
can I say that?
they don't imply that the people have power.
Can I, but in the real world, sometimes those come into contradiction, and the idea that you can't have that rupturism is a dead end because it forgoes some of the utopian democratic demands that people may have. it's to doom the project before it even.
So, yeah, so one view is that it's not that we need a dictatorship of the proletariat, we need a dictatorship for the proletariat. That is, we need a straightforward dictatorship that does good things. I think that the revolutions that occurred did some good things. I'm not denying that. The record of healthcare and education in Cuba is astounding by the historic standards of the 50s and 60s when those occurred. So dictatorships can do good things, but they're not democratic. And to call the dictatorship for the proletariat a democratic dictatorship is, I think, a misuse of words. And the historic record is, I think, that with respect to democratic values, which I hold as extremely strong values, especially in the context of developed capitalist economies, the democratic values I hold extremely strongly. I don't think authoritarian dictatorships morph into democratic egalitarian societies. You'd need a second revolution then. I mean, it would just take a second revolution because there's no transition story for how authoritarian, bureaucratic, command and control, nasty regimes that may do some good things become democracies.
But that's not ours.
It would be good if we had some questions or contributions, just to balance things, not from the revolutionary background. If there's anyone here who isn't a revolutionary. But the next question comes from the back.
Yeah. My name is Ada Schrein. Yeah, just two questions, none of them to do with rupture, so that's convenient. First thing, it was just the point you're making about how, I suppose, rupturalism tends to, or in your from your perspective, tends to be, would tend to be undemocratic in happening, and therefore would lead to undemocratic ends. I think maybe there's I suppose just thinking how the procedure of how you do something has an impact on the outcome. There's similar maybe dangers in terms of what you've called interstitial methods, that like a lot of those projects are quite visionary, quite intellectually driven. Any kind of new alternatives tend to be, and that there can be a tendency towards exclusion in those as well, which I think, I don't know, I suppose maybe ill-informed, but would think would have negative impacts on the kind of democratic outcomes also. So I suppose, would you have any perspectives on that? And then the second point is just in relation to what you said on, you were talking about how, I suppose, worker-owned cooperatives keep jobs. I think what you're saying was keep jobs local, and that serves the interests of capital. And by that, I presume you mean the capitalist government, because they're interested in votes. Is that right? Am I right in understanding that?
So, when we use the term the capitalist class, it's not a homogeneous entity. There are some capitalists, a significant part of the capitalist class, have stakes in the local and regional economy, and others are global financiers that have no stake whatsoever in the local economy. Right? That's a crucial division within the capitalist class, because capitalists who make their money in things like real estate and in shopping malls have an interest in a vibrant local economy, because that's who buys their stuff. They make their money through a local accumulation process. If all accumulation was global, then the prospects of doing anything locally would become extremely thin. Now, because there is a significant segment of the capitalist class with real class interests in a locally vibrant economy, things which help to sustain a locally vibrant economy are good for those capitalists.
I suppose, so the question coming from it is just, I think maybe there might be a difference in an economy that's quite as globalised as the Irish economy is from a capitalist class perspective, in terms of whether or not having rooted jobs is actually good for the interests of capital. I'm just thinking, yeah, is that a difference maybe between a small globalised economy like the Irish one and others? That's the second.
Yeah, so I don't, of course it's a question that'll vary from country to country. I mean, the American economy, it's a very big economy, and although it has a very powerful global capitalist class, a very substantial part of the income generated by the American economy is generated by small and medium firms that are dealing with local and regional markets. And that provides for an articulation of capitalist and non-capitalist forms that could be beneficial to those capitalists, even if the big, giant corporations could care less about it. It's that kind of complexity in the structure of capitalism that opens up spaces, sort of interstitial strategies refer to strategies that take advantage of the cracks and spaces and dislocations of capitalism. Assumes it's not a homogeneous totalizing system. It's a fractured system with all sorts of different spaces. I like, just one little additional comment, I like to think of the economy as an ecosystem more than an organism. So that when we say we have a capitalist economy, we mean we're in an economic ecosystem within which capitalism is dominant. It's the dominant species in our pond, so to speak. And there's a variety of capitalisms that coexist simultaneously within the pond. It's that heterogeneity of an ecosystem that creates the possibility of other species, non-capitalist species occupying niches. Now, if those niches remain entirely isolated and on the fringes, they might be nice for the particular participants who live in them, but they aren't going to do much to change the character of the ecosystem at all. The idea of interstitial and symbiotic strategies is that we can do something about the ecosystem. We can expand the space under which these non-capitalist forms can develop without knowing how far we can go. And that we can enlist aspects of the capitalist state in that. There are municipal governments which are beholden to local real estate agents' interests, and local shopping malls, and local farmers. I mean, there are local states that have resources, and which, in my city, the local state underwrote the creation of a worker-owned taxi company. You know, they provided the initial grant of money so that the workers in a striking taxi company, when they could buy out the firm and create a worker-owned taxi cooperative. And that was in the interest of the local state and the local capitalists there. It was not in the interest of the big banks and finance capital.
Next questions here, then we had Valerie, then Felina, and then
Hi, Paul Bowman from the Worker Solidarity Movement, which is an Irish revolutionary anarchist organisation. I don't want to talk about rupture, although I could. And obviously, we, as anarchists, we have a slightly different model from the Leninists, actually a very different model. But I want to talk about the problematize the idea of growth, particularly as it relates to the viability of the symbiotic thing, if you like. Because capitalism, the logic of capitalism so far, historically, has produced a form of growth that involves using more and more non-renewable resources, more and more stuff, etc. And if you look at the logic of how capital economizes labor time compared to stuff processed, it's continually ejecting labor from the immediate production process, and then in order to sort of reestablish its control by bringing it back into jobs, it then has to make these people produce more stuff. So there's a kind of a logic there that is leading to an unsustainable use of natural resources and so on. So I guess my question for you is, where in the symbiotic strategy do we find a problem of addressing this problem of growth in terms of the non-sustainability of it?
No, I agree completely that capitalism is a growth machine, and that's one of its most damaging features in the contemporary context. So, you know, although we were having the back and forth about the 20-year versus 40-year horizon or whatever, I certainly agree with the contradiction between capitalism and a sustainable environment. So the question is, what alternatives can we envision? Is there anything we can envision doing inside of capitalism that is short of abolishing capitalism? So if you could snap your fingers and abolish capitalism, that potentially, but only potentially, would be good for the environment. Depends on what comes after. Could be worse for the environment. Depends on what comes after. If militarized authoritarian statism comes after, that could be worse for the environment. So depends on what comes after, whether snapping your fingers and getting rid of capitalism actually makes things better. But the question is whether there's any form of interstitial and symbiotic transformations which bear on this question. I think one of the ideas of building non-capitalist enclaves and expanding them within capitalism is to increase the capacity of people to exit from the high growth regime into alternatives without becoming destitute. I mean, it's very hard for people to exit that system in a way that enhances their own flourishing and capacities in any meaningful way. So a basic income capitalism combined with worker cooperative forms is a enclave, which may be small or large, and that matters, in which people can opt for a non-growth strategy, and therefore be a demonstration. I mean, part of what the idea of an interstitial strategy involves is proving to people that alternative ways of life are lives that flourish and are possible. And then it may, to get back to our clashing theme, it may or may not prove that the obstacles to expanding that enclave beyond a small space to a large space are impossible to overcome. It may be that that's a complete impasse, and at that point it may be the case that the only solution could be an attempt at rupture, but it might also be at that point it's still the case that rupture is impossible. I mean, I don't know the answer to that. I have no prediction as to what the limits of possibility are, and whether when those limits are reached, the limits can be shattered. What I know is that in the present moment, the limits can't, I believe. When I say I know, I mean, to the best of my knowledge, under my understanding of how the world works, capitalism is not smashable.
Valerie, if we can keep them short now because we do have 15 minutes left, only about 5.
We all agree that capitalism is there for nothing but to make profit, and the worker has to try and sustain itself in the system. And your theory on cooperatives. Today we're living in a globalized financial crisis, which is very evident in your own country, is absolutely very, very difficult, as also in Ireland. Now, when you refer to the cooperatives in America, you are a much bigger country, but in relative terms to Ireland running a cooperative as well, you need money to run cooperatives. You need money to run small businesses, be it America or Ireland or European. So we're all connected now with, globally rather than nationally as we used to be many years ago, but with the new transition we are now global international partners. So my question is, when you talk about cooperatives being a way forward to, I don't know whether you're trying to say you're trying to integrate it, that it will eventually become a socialist state and then we'll all have our needs met. Or you're saying that the capitalist system can't be smashed. Well, the capitalist system represents 1% of the people and we are the 99%. So I don't get your theory how you feel that cooperatives and small business will somehow sustain society when at the moment of the capitalism we have an unsustainable system. And I don't know if I make myself clear, but everything needs investment because the system of capitalism is talking about investment and money and profit. So how do you make that cooperative non-profit and small business non-profit when we have a need to get financial investment from bankers? So that's what I'd like to.
So there's a couple of conceptual points that I think need to be sharpened in order to answer the question. And one of them has to do with what we even mean when we talk about socialism. So one vision of socialism is that it's an economy with no markets, that markets have been completely abolished. That's one view. Michael Albert in his Participatory Economics argues for a democratically planned, non-market economy. It's and it also has certain anarchist resonances, a non-market economy of associated producers engaged in mutualism rather than in market exchange. I'm very skeptical of the viability of a model of complex economies in which market exchange has been eliminated. So the question then, the question of socialism then is, what's the articulation between new forms of enterprise? You'll still have people getting together cooperatively to produce things. What's the appropriate way of understanding the social character of those enterprises? as they engage in market relations and as they relate to a new form of the state. So this is talking about what the destination is, not how we get there. This is the middle part of the book on alternatives, not the last part of the book on transformation. So I think of worker-owned firms are one constituent type of firm within a socialist market economy. There's other types of firms within a socialist market economy, or what for this purpose, I call a cooperative market economy. There's, a socialist economy is more than just a cooperative market economy, so I think worker-owned firms are crucial. And if they're crucial in our destination, then they're one of the examples of something we can build now that's prefiguring what we want. That is, some things we might want, we can't build now. Some things we might want, we can build now. And if you can build them now, it serves multiple purposes. You're making the future world present in the actual world. You're demonstrating to people that this future possibility is viable. The people who live in these new institutions prefer them and flourish in them. There's all sorts of good things that happen if you can scale them up to the point where they have social visibility and ideological weight. And then they might also make subsequent transformations easier because you have a platform of more cooperative and collaborative relations already being built in the world as it is. So there's all sorts of reasons, regardless of how you come down on the issue of rupture or not, why figuring out the extent to which we can expand that space, how we can do it. Now, of course, those institutions need resources. They absolutely do. It's one of the advantages of being very wealthy and high productive economies that even under these crisis conditions, people are living much better. They have more resources at their disposal than they did 50 years ago or 70 years ago in the 30s crisis. That's certainly true in the United States. I asked at lunch about Ireland if you look at the pre-boom period of Ireland, let's say the early 80s, before this 15-year episode beginning in the 90s until recently, if you just extrapolated the per capita curve from the 70s to the present, without that leap, would the current situation be above or below what the non-boom period would have predicted? And I was told it's probably still above what it would the simple extrapolation from the past is. Well, that's part of people's lived experience, but it also means there's more resources around. The question is, how do we mobilize them? Mondragon did it by having a bank that workers put their money in, a regular bank, but it was a cooperative bank, and it was used to provide credit for cooperatives. There's no reason why cooperative banks can't be organized again with that mission, and there's also no reason why they can't be underwritten by the state. Why the state wouldn't see advantages, because it's not a challenge. See, here's the thing about the contradictory character of symbiotic processes. It's not really a challenge to capitalism because it solves problems to capitalism. The challenge to capitalism is in the spaces it makes possible. It's not that it itself destroys capitalism. It doesn't. That's why it's a contradictory policy.